For the right person, a mid-range phone can be the perfect balance of features and cost. Admittedly, it is a delicate balance, because you'll inevitably lose out on something when you compare it to the more expensive phones. Samsung walks this tightrope every year, focusing on a couple of key parts of the experience while compromising on a few others to get it down to a more palatable price point. I'm Cam Bunton from Trusted Reviews, and this is the Galaxy A57. The latest in a long line of mid-market phones, and while not perfect, it hits the mark in a few areas. So let's get into it, and while you're here, if you do like this video while you're watching it, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe and tap that notification bell. Cheers! There are both good and bad elements in the design department. But for the most part, the A57 does a really good job of disguising the fact that it's not one of the more expensive phones. There's no plastic to be found anywhere, with both front and back adorned with Gorilla Glass Victus Plus. And I really like how Samsung's played with different glass finishes to achieve some contrast and visual appeal. The dark glossy back plays off nicely with the slightly opaque frosted finish around the camera island, in a way that I think makes it better looking than the more expensive Galaxy S series. At least it is until you actually pick it up and use it, because that glossy dark finish on the back is a proper fingerprint magnet. One touch and smears will appear. Perhaps then a case of giving with one hand and taking away with the other. It's a similar thought when looking at the aluminium frame and the front of the phone, because I do really like that raised area on the right edge where the volume and side buttons live. It makes that aluminium edge less boring somehow, but then there's a bit of a chin on the bezel, where Samsung hasn't quite managed to give us a uniform bezel on all four sides and corners around the display. But still, it comes across as a well thought through and purposeful design. And the thing I noticed first when I unboxed it was how light and thin it feels, despite being quite a big phone. For a phone with such a large display, it has a nimbleness that belies the numbers on the spec sheet. It's slightly thinner and lighter than the Galaxy S26 Plus, and considerably more so than the S26 Ultra. It's obviously still a way off being as skinny as the S25 Edge, but at the same time, when you realise it's packed in a battery that's the same capacity as the larger and heavier Ultra, it's impossible not to be impressed. It shares the same water and dust resistance rating as its more expensive cousins too, so if you happen to like walks in the rain, it should cope just fine. Now, just like its design and build, the display is a highlight on the A57. Using it to watch movies or game on, I was never left with the sense that I was using an inferior display, even though technically I was. It doesn't quite reach the same brightness levels of the S26 series, but it's still very bright, vivid and colour-rich, making it a joy to stream videos and get hooked into social media feeds on. The fact that it's 6.7 inches diagonally helps too. It's an expansive canvas with few noticeable weaknesses. Any real weaknesses only show in other areas. As an example, it can hit 120Hz refresh rates, meaning it has the ability to ramp up to be super smooth and sharp even with quick animations. However, because it's not an LTPO panel, it can't adapt those refresh rates at small 1Hz increments like the top tier phones do. You might not notice that at all during video watching or gaming, but it can be noticed when moving quickly from a static page to a moving one. Like when you swipe quickly to go to the home screen from a browser page. Going from not moving to moving, the display often leads to the odd frame drop and stuttering animation. It's not horrendous and maybe not even all that noticeable unless you're used to the more expensive super fluid and responsive phones, but it was something that I saw happen fairly frequently. This lack of ultra adaptive refreshing also affects the battery life, but I'll get more into that later on. But the short version of that takeaway is that the less efficient display means that if you use your phone a lot, you'll drain the battery quicker than if you had one of the more expensive Galaxy S series phones. One other weakness in the display has nothing to do with the display at all, but more to do with the fingerprint sensor that's built into it. Unlike the more premium models, it doesn't have an ultrasonic scanner, but rather an older optical one. And it's not a great optical sensor based on my experience. It takes a comparatively long time to set up, and you have to hold your finger on it for a second or two before it registers. Plus, in my experience, the first attempt fails fairly frequently. There's a possibility I've just become too accustomed to the high-end ultrasonic scanners on the more premium devices. But I've also used mid-range devices with optical scanners that aren't as slow and finicky as this one. Despite the minor compromises, however, I will say this. If your time is spent mostly on social media, YouTube, and casual video watching or gaming, I think you'll struggle to find a better display than the A57's for that. at least in this price range. It's a really wonderful canvas for just about everything. It's in the camera department you start to see the obvious signs that we're dealing with a mid-range phone here. There are 3 cameras, as is fairly typical, but one of those is a low-resolution macro camera, which effectively acts as a backup lens for close-up photography. You do get an ultra-wide lens as well as that main camera alongside the macro. How well this camera serves you will likely depend on the conditions that you usually like to shoot your photos in or what you like to take photos of. Outside in bright daylight, it does a pretty good job of delivering sharp, bright and vibrant photos. There is a little over-sharpening and contrast boosting in that processing that make the image pop on screen, but being critical, it can often appear overexposed, particularly in the brighter parts of the image, but that's being quite nitpicky. It struggles at times with scenes when there's bright backlighting and HDR needs to kick in, often leading the shadowed foreground object just that little bit too dark. And on that note, there are times when shadowed areas in not so well lit indoor scenes or even grey clouds in the skies can be a little bit grainy and noisy. One of the plus points is that the main sensor is large enough and pixel dense enough that you can punch into 2x zoom and still get a pretty decent image. That doesn't obviously lack in sharpness. It makes up for that lack of a dedicated zoom camera slightly, but putting it side by side with the Galaxy S26, with its 3x zoom camera, the A57 does struggle with anything beyond that 2x mark. Image quality falls away quite rapidly once you go above 2x, and in my testing, really not worth going anywhere beyond 5x. Indoors, away from the super bright light sources, again it does a decent job of capturing colour and detail. You will probably start seeing that aforementioned noise and grain in darker parts of the image and see the camera struggle a bit with focusing, especially moving objects like Richard Parker, my pet cat. At night time, launching into the dedicated night mode can result in some bright in-focus images. The primary camera is definitely stronger than the ultra-wide at drinking in light, which can sometimes struggle to contain details in brighter parts of the image. But it's hard to be too critical. The important thing to note is that regardless of the conditions, it is possible to get a good enough image that you'd be happy to share it with friends or on social media. Of course, it's not quite as strong or versatile as phones that cost twice as much, but I suspect for most people looking at this phone, the cameras are more than good enough. As a video maker, the lack of 4K recording at 60 frames per second is a tad disappointing. Shooting 4K 30 frames per second is okay, but I often found the footage a little grainy, lacking in sharpness and smoothness. Particularly when panning across a scene, there was some stuttering and a rolling shutter-like effect. Having to jump down to 1080p to get 60 frames per second means you basically have to choose between whether you want sharp footage or smooth footage. You can't have both. So it's probably not one for content creators. Performance, like cameras, is another area you'll see a difference between these mid-ranger phones and the top-tier models. But just like the camera department, whether or not it's got enough juice depends very much on what you do. For the most part, the experience of using the A57 is fluid and smooth. As mentioned when I was talking about the display, there is a little bit of stutter and frame dropping in the user interface when going between static and moving content on the screen. But once it gets going, it's responsive and quick. Inside, the phone has the Exynos 1680 processor, which is a very middle-of-the-road type of chip. It's got enough grunt that it'll easily handle most of your casual tasks. Casual games aren't a struggle at all, but I did spot that it would often drop the resolution in some games to keep that gameplay smooth. Mario Kart, which has long been my go-to game on mobile, didn't look as sharp as it does on the more powerful models. But crucially, the gameplay wasn't hampered by frame dropping at all, and so it feels pretty smooth. It's a powerful enough chipset that it can also handle quite a lot of the AI-based tasks on the phone that are built into the software. Using bixby to call up settings options wasn't as snappy and instant as the S26, but it also wasn't too much of a hindrance either. As is always the case, tempering expectations is always advised with performance. You're not going to be able to play the highest fidelity games in their highest settings, and if you did, you'd soon find the phone chugging to a halt. But if your game time mostly involves games like Block Blast, Mario Kart or something more casual, the A57 has more than enough power for those. Tempering expectations is also advised with the battery. Samsung advertises this phone as having a 2-day battery, and whether or not that's achievable very much depends on your screen time and the type of phone user that you are. But for busy power users, I think you'll get 1 full day, but not 2. When the screen is on, even playing the casual games I mentioned before, the battery seems to drain a little quicker than the more powerful S26 models. even the smallest one which has a smaller battery. My suspicion is that because it can't drop as low as 1 Hz on static pages, and is at the minimum of 60 Hz all the time, it uses a lot more energy to power that display, especially considering how bright it is. On my lighter days, and I'm a pretty light user already, I could make it last 2 days, but that's true of most phones these days. It's very conservative with battery use in standby mode with the always on display disabled. So if your screen use is 2 to 3 hours a day and mostly low intensity tasks, I think 2 days might just be possible. Now, charging speeds when empty are quick enough to be convenient, but again, not market leading. A full charge in my testing took about 75 minutes, but you can get 50% of it topped up in the first 25 minutes. So in those times when you've run empty and you're in a rush to get out again, it'll top up just about enough to keep you going. You just need to make sure you have a compatible 45-watt charger to get those speeds. On the whole, Samsung's Galaxy A57 shares a lot of the same strengths as its previous models. It's a very capable phone with a brilliant big display built into a big phone that somehow feels lightweight and thin. Any compromises like imperfect cameras and performance or battery life are largely expected at this price point. But costing just over £500 for the base model is about on par what you'd expect for this phone from Samsung. What's a little harder to accept is that if you want more storage than the 256GB base model, you're going to need nearly £200 more to get it. And at that price, you can get a much better phone from just about anyone. But let me know what you think of the Galaxy A57. Has Samsung focused on all the right parts with this mid-ranger, or is it still missing the mark? Let me know in the comments or grab me on Threads. I'm at Cam Bunton. If you did like this video, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe and tap that notification bell, and I'll see you again in the next one. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye.